Hi, I'm Alissandra Cummins, Director of the Barbedos Museum and Historical Society, and it's a special pleasure to be here with you today, reflecting on these very important questions you have about the development of a national museum. Almost a century after emancipation was enacted in Barbados in 1834, came the establishment of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. However, this was much built on the earliest ideas of what a museum could and should be, which was being debated in the columns of the Barbadian newspaper in April 1842, where society debated the proposal for a Barbados Institute and Colonial Museum. In other words, it was very much considered to be important as an improving institution to help shape the morals and behaviours of the post-slavery society that was Barbados. It says a lot, though, that it was not until 1933 that our museum opened its doors. Even then, it was under the auspices of a group of concerned citizens that an act was passed for the establishment of what was then a private society of antiquarian interests rather than a governmental institution. However, the landscape in which the museum was embedded began to change. From the late 1950s, there were shifts in the visible cultural practices and organizations of Barbados that moved away from the colonial British traditions into celebrating Afrocentric aspects of Barbadian cultural identity. Chamberlain lists, for example, such societies that were established with the direct objective of debate, education, and raising cultural consciousness. Dan Blackett's Social, Physical, Cultural Club, the Bank Hall Cultural Club, Arlington Newton's Universal Nutrition Society, and the Forum Club. So social, cultural, and even sports clubs were the order of the day. One of these was the Yoruba House or Yoruba Yard, founded by Ilambe Motley, which catalyzed a conscious shift towards indigenous and Afrocentric performance, dance, music, and language. Although primarily a theatre group, Yoruba House supported a wide range of creative development, including the visual arts, from which many of our contemporary masters of sculpture and painting have emerged today. Farmer states that in the post-independence era, there was also an active direction to nationalize museum spaces in the Caribbean. This was arguably a project of Barbados having hosted the Carafesta Festival in 1981, and the government's mandate to support the hosting of multiple regional events and exhibitions within the many spaces and places needed to give expression to this mission, which generated a mandate to stimulate and facilitate cultural development through the creation of a national cultural foundation under the leadership of the same Ilambe Motley. However, the notion of establishing a national cultural foundation suggests that there was an established national culture and begs the question of who sketched the parameters of what that culture is. What is included as a national culture and what is excluded? This was in large part driven by two key developments. On the one hand, a major workshop developed by the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM, in 1978 pointed to the major characteristics of what role a Barbados Museum should perform. This was spelled out in a related report by the CARICOM Museum's consultant. Singleton indicated that each museum shall make maximum appeal to its own community and be readily accepted as an educational and cultural force within that community. Any visitor to the museum, whether local resident or tourist, should be able to derive from it a complete explanation of the community's past and present way of life. For this to take place required then that government must accept that museums are an important part of national development and in consequence should provide the necessary support. The other critical development was the creation of the National Council of Libraries, Archives and Documentation Centres, or NACLADs, in 1980, which had amongst its terms of reference to design a national plan for the development and management of museums, archives and modern records, which, and I quote, must reflect the national character as well as the nation's history and must be a centre for community cultural activity. It was this working group, given this term of reference, which took the first step towards the elaboration of a museum development plan in October 1980. And this led to the elaboration of the first 1982 five-year development plan of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, a report representing recommendations from the Ministry of Information appointed committee on a development plan for the BMHS. The aim of the committee was the development of a national museum policy aimed at changing the character of the museum in order to make it truly representative of the history, culture and development of Barbadian society. Specifically, the report highlights that the collection of the BMHS contains an imbalance of representation, with a great deal of material on the Barbadian plantocracy and very little on the history of the enslaved. African cultural survivals and folk culture, traditional craft, maritime history, histories of Jewish and Asian communities, vernacular architecture, amongst others. The major result of this was the reinvigoration of the Jubilee Gallery at the BMHS in 1985, and for the first time it showcased work related to the period of enslavement in a more detailed and direct way as part of the historical story of Barbados. In 1986, the Journal of the Museum recorded that it gives a glimpse into the first impressions of a new gallery from the wider society members. Peter Campbell, editor at the time, writes that the Jubilee Gallery aims to convey to the visitor something of the story of Barbados from prehistoric times to the 20th century. However, it was ultimately the establishment of this gallery that I'm in, the African Gallery, in 1990, which critically makes an important shift in the museum's epistemologies, which demanded and delivered an authentic African voice within the museum's exhibitionary space, which placed it on the same level as the previous galleries did. During the 1980s and 1990s, the preservation of historic plantation houses or sugar factories saw a rise in popularity across the region. In Barbados, properties such as St. Nicholas Abbey, Sunbury Plantation, Port Vale Sugar Museum opened their doors for business. At the same time, the historic house museums, along with George Washington House and military histories such as Gun Hill Signal Station, which can often erase the historical reference to enslavement, have been maintained under a model of heritage tourism, which arguably has formed a pathway for museology that supports cultural erasure or suppression. Williams emphasizes that heritage for tourism is a neo-colonial phenomenon that could exploit the Caribbean region. Marissa Fuentes reminds us that visible aspects of colonial power exist in urban areas as well, and that they were not exempt from systemic displays of brutal power. However, one museum which attempts to negotiate the space of heritage tourism in a community-led way is Arlington House Museum in Speightstown. This site highlights the home of the Skinner family, marine merchant owners throughout several generations. In 2014, the care of the museum was managed by the Barbados National Trust and went through a series of renovations, creating interactive displays that drew from the voices of those who lived and live in Speightstown. Another model of a museum as a platform to share a national story became more prominent, where we see the emergence of a specific hierarchy of museum models, such as Tirlcott Heritage Village of 1990, the Folk Museum at Ford Square Rum Distillery in 1996, the National Heroes Gallery as part of the Museum of Parliament in 2007, the Cricket Legends of Barbados Museum in 2007. These arguably had very distinct notions of what a Barbadian cultural identity was, informed by the narratives provided by the Barbados National Trust and the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. With the establishment of the Nide Israel Synagogue Museum in 2009 and the Exchange Interactive Center in 2016, the national narratives continue to expand even further to include Barbados business and Masonic history and Jewish history. Considering the discussion on community museums, Springvale Indigenous Folk Museum can also be included in relation to these heritage site developments. New museum approaches have been generated even within the last 5 to 10 years. Through, for example, the School of Medical Sciences at the University of the West Indies, which is moving towards the establishment of the Cecil Cyrus Caribbean Museum of Medical History. Efforts are also underway with the development of a Gary Sobers Museum of Caribbean Cricket, and the long-standing initiative which seems finally to be coming to fruition, the establishment of the Barbados National Art Gallery. All of these speak to just some of the ways Barbadians are coming to conserve and communicate their multiple heritages. Co-curatorship is a key aspect of the new museological direction of the BMHS. In 2019, the museum piloted a new model of museum development through its participation in the EULAC Museums project. The Enigma of Arrival, the Politics and Poetics of Caribbean Migration to Britain exhibition embraced a collaborative, community-driven approach to storytelling. It aimed to explore and share the untold narratives of Caribbean migration by fostering partnerships between museums, communities and researchers both in Barbados and its diasporas, in almost direct reversal to the colonial model which was required earlier. Drawing on the concept of a community of curatorial practice, the project emphasized learning and co-curation, involving shared efforts to uncover and present collective histories. The process began with collaborative research led by the University of the West Indies and the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. Community involvement was integral, and with open calls inviting individuals and institutions to share artifacts, images, and memories. These contributions shaped the exhibition's content, which underwent review and refinement with feedback from regional audiences. This iterative approach ensured diverse voices and perspectives were represented during the process. The project also encouraged sustainable exchanges. Exhibition panels, for example, were shared across the Caribbean and in the diaspora, showing or allowing local communities to adapt and build on the content. Since its debut in Barbados in 2019, the exhibition has evolved with every iteration, growing richer through the involvement of new hosts and audiences. Another example of this type of work is evident in the Barbados Museum's 2023 exhibition, Looker, Dismantling the Colonial Gaze, which took a deep dive into unpacking colonial legacies through postcards, photography, and artistic interventions. Led by a collective of 5 young Barbadian women artists, the project challenged the historical objectification and commodification of black bodies by re-examining how colonial-era tourism used photography to portray the West Indies as an idyllic paradise. The exhibition highlighted how black Barbadians were often depicted, sometimes without consent, for white consumption and profit. Through their work, these artists confronted the stereotypes and power imbalances created by colonialism, calling for a more inclusive and critical engagement with visual history. They advocated for museums to involve communities and families tied to these images, offering a chance to reclaim agency and tell untold stories. Looker not only critiqued the colonial ethnographic gaze, which until then largely drove the presentation of historical photography in our galleries, but also invited fresh perspectives, encouraging viewers to see beyond the surface and understand the humanity and heritage of those represented in these historical records. More recently, as part of our core exhibit redesign process, the BMHS has also launched a project entitled Our Stories, Our Museum, an opportunity for our communities in Barbados and abroad to contribute directly to the narratives that will be included in these exhibitions. The title of the project is a very deliberate attempt to decentralize the source of knowledge authority regarding sharing heritage in a museum. It is a recognition that stories currently in the museum may not be a full reflection of the multiplicities of Barbadian identities. In our stories, the idea is that the curators become facilitators, and the museum becomes a vessel to take care of and share everyone's stories, not just those national narratives which appear in the history books. It demonstrates that we can develop new museological research that listens to multiple ways communities engage with us that may not fit into the traditional mode of documentation, and that's okay. The idea of whose story and whose museum can be revisited as a continual process of lateral exchanges. It's now my pleasure to invite you to watch our special video on this particular project called Our Stories, Our Museum.
Exciting things are happening in the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. We need you.
We're thrilled to introduce Our Stories, Our Museum, a community-led project to reimagine, redesign, and revitalize our long-term galleries.
In the year of regathering, this is your chance to shape your museum. Everyone at home and abroad, we want to hear from you.
What stories do you want told?
What memory and mementos are special to you?
What makes our heritage uniquely Barbadian?
We're inviting all voices to join us in retelling our shared stories. Share your ideas, images, and experiences, and help us create a museum that truly reflects you.
Submit your contributions today on our chalkboard or via the QR code, because your voice matters.
These are our stories, our museum. Thank you very much for this very important invitation to participate in the discussions around the development of plans and ideas for a national museum for Djibouti. Thank you to the government of Djibouti for including me in this discussion.